So this video is going to be fairly instructive. I'll give tips on how to build mileage safely and effectively. Whether you're a relatively new runner or a fairly experienced one, you'll likely have gotten to a point where you feel you're unable to bump things up without severely raising your risk of injury. Maybe it feels like there's no space in your schedule to do that, or you're already struggling to recover from what you're currently doing. Now, I spent years stuck at about 80 kilometers a week until I finally figured out a way to press beyond that and push my mileage up without getting injured. So in this video, I'm going to talk through some of the strategies that I've learned throughout my 15 years of running. But first, why build mileage at all? Well, I'm guessing that most people that have clicked on this video acknowledge that running more is pretty much the best way to become a better distance runner. And I'd argue that you aren't going to see drastic long-term improvements without increasing your mileage. Running higher intensity workouts may take you from 1930 to 1830 in the 5K, for example, but without significantly increasing your mileage, those workouts aren't going to take you from 1930 down to 1530. You can disagree, that's fine. Some people still do, and that's to their own detriment, but 99.9% of elite distance runners are doing high mileage. And we know what happens when elite runners don't do high mileage, but instead focus on high intensity. That was the convention in the 90s and early 2000s. High mileage fell out of favor in the West, largely thanks to the success of Sebastian Coe, and it was replaced by a low volume, high intensity approach. And what was the result? Well, that was the worst period for Western runners on the world stage in the history of the sport. So we've run that experiment, and it didn't work. Elite athletes are doing the kind of mileage they were doing back in the 60s and 70s because that tends to produce the best results. But anyway, the point of this video isn't to convince anyone. It's to offer practical suggestions on how to build mileage sustainably. So I guess I'll start by laying out 4 guidelines on how to do that. Number 1 is being consistent. Number 2 is incremental increases. Number 3 is spreading the load, and number 4 is lowering intensity. So number 1, being consistent. It's such a cliche in running circles, but it's a cliche for a reason. It's essentially a prerequisite for long-term improvement. You just aren't going to build fitness without stacking consistent week on top of consistent week. It's simple. When you aren't running frequently enough, the signal for adaptation isn't persistent in a way that's going to drive the bodily acquisition of more running-specific characteristics. Similarly, when we run less frequently, we detrain and lose some of those previously acquired characteristics. It's a bit of a tug of war. We have to keep pressure on just to maintain our position. If we ease off, we lose ground. So analogies aside, in order to be consistent, you need to create a training plan or have your coach create one for you, and you need to stick to that plan. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to run every day. If you're new to running, you may only run 3 days a week at first, and you can have planned rest days. But the point is, you need to do your utmost to stick to this plan. I tend to find that missing a scheduled run makes it much easier to miss a second and a third and so on. And we want to avoid having a decision to make every time we're about to go for a run. What we want is for it to become part of our routine. In the same way that we don't ask the question, should I brush my teeth this morning? We don't mull this over, we just do it. It's part of our day. This plan also shouldn't be so difficult that it becomes a challenge just to will yourself out the door, or that each run becomes a death march. So make a plan that's very achievable, maybe even too easy at first. Because if it isn't, you not only risk getting injured, it's likely that you'll give up on it fairly quickly. So let's move on to number 2, incremental increases. So your body is an organism that responds to training by breaking down at first and then building back up. Through this process, you gradually increase your ability to tolerate training load. But the key word here is gradually. This happens at a glacial pace. If the breakdown happens too acutely, or you don't allow adequate time for recovery, then you're going to get injured or sick or overtrained, and your performances aren't going to improve. So we just want small amounts of anything new. Enough so that our body is forced to do a little bit more, but not so much that it can't handle it. The old guideline used to be, don't increase your volume by more than 10% from week to week, but I think that's a pretty broad guideline, and it's not really a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. I certainly think if you're around 30 kilometers a week and you increase to 33 kilometers a week, that's not unreasonable at all. But for me personally, running 145 kilometers a week and then upping that in one fell swoop to 159, that seems incredibly risky. So our next guideline is number 3, spreading the load. So to highlight this point, I didn't increase my mileage by adding in an extra 10k run or by throwing an extra 40 minutes on the end of my long run. I spread the increases throughout the week, adding an extra kilometre, sometimes half a kilometre here and there. Also, another tip, and this may not be possible for everyone, but I recommend introducing doubles as early as possible. I was reluctant to do this, and I think this is why I found the increase from 80 kilometers a week to 100. That seemed to be the hardest gulf to cross. It was this odd point where I was doing an hour or more of running a day, which felt like a lot, but I didn't think that I needed doubles just yet. And to be honest, I was kind of afraid of doubling. In hindsight, I shouldn't have been. I found that doing 2 shorter runs in a day is far less stressful on the body than doing 1 longer run. And so if I had have introduced doubles earlier, I would have reduced my risk of injury, and it would have made it far easier for me to get beyond the 80-kilometre hump. So rather than doing 12 to 13 kilometres as an easy or recovery run on the days between sessions, I could have done an 8k run in the morning and a 6k run in the afternoon. By doing this, not only would I have got an extra kilometre in for the day, it would have been far easier on my body, and I would have been far fresher for the following day's session. Now, lots of people will argue that a continuous 12 to 13 kilometre run is far better for fitness than 2 runs of 8 and 6 kilometres. And in isolation, that may be the case. I'm not totally convinced, but for simplicity's sake, I'll let that go. But when we zoom out and look at how those runs fit into the whole training week, we're much better placed to get more out of our workouts, we're doing more work overall, and we're in a better position to continually increase that mileage. If you're trying to increase these easy recovery runs out to 70, 80, or even 90 minutes, it becomes exponentially more challenging to actually recover in time for the next workout. But I found it quite manageable to increase that 8 and 6 to an 8 and 7, then an 8 and 8, and then a 9 and 8, and I still feel like I have room to spare. So moving on to number 4, lowering intensity. Now the rule tends to be that you shouldn't increase volume and intensity at the same time, and I would agree with that. It's why elite runners tend to do a base phase where they focus on building mileage, and while doing this, they strip out as much intensity as necessary. Now I think that the lower your mileage is, the more intensity you need to strip out in order to push that volume up. For example, if your mileage is around 20 to 30 kilometers a week, I'd forgo all intensity in the short term and just focus on getting your mileage up to 50 kilometers a week. If you're only running 20 to 30 kilometers a week, you're so far away from your full potential, and the only way to make inroads into that potential is to run a lot more. Sure, you may have to sacrifice short-term gratification in the form of races and doing fast workouts where you get a bit of a rush from hitting fast splits, but all of those times will fade into insignificance once you increase your volume and you're running much, much faster. Now, in addition to removing workouts from your schedule, it may be the case that you also need to slow down your standard runs or easy runs, whatever you want to call them. Running at a truly easy pace will drastically reduce your chance of injury, especially as you're trying to push your mileage up. What I see among many amateur runners, and I personally made the same mistake in the early years, is they get stuck in a logjam where they can't increase their mileage because even their easy runs are quite taxing. They're walking a very fine line where if they increase the stress any further, they're going to fall off the edge. In this case, clearly something has to give in order to progress, and the obvious answer is to slow down. And there seems to be a feeling or a common belief that if I slow down my runs, I'll lose fitness. But this just isn't the case, and I do have a video which discusses this topic in more detail here. Essentially, you aren't really getting any significant fitness benefit from running 20 seconds a kilometre or 30 seconds a mile faster on your easy runs. However, the fatigue cost of running at that faster pace is substantial. It's way out of proportion to the benefit you get, and it will drastically limit your ability to run more. And as previously mentioned, it's this volume increase that's going to provide those bigger gains. So from a cost-benefit analysis, we're far better off slowing down so that we can run more and do it with less risk of injury. So now what I'm going to do is walk you through a specific example of how to increase your mileage. I'll utilize all of the guidelines that I've previously discussed, and you'll see for yourself how this can work. Now this example is for a runner who's stuck at 60 kilometers a week, spread across 6 days. You can scale this however you want, down, up. So for example, if you're at 30 kilometers a week, in order to scale it down, you could just adjust all of the increases by half, and then you'd be following my example perfectly. I can also tell you that in this example, I'm going to take this 60 kilometer a week runner up to 84 kilometers in the space of 12 weeks. Now, many people would say that's too big or too sudden of a jump. And I would agree with that in many cases, especially given the way most people try to increase mileage. But once you see how I'm suggesting you do this, you'll likely think that I'm being too conservative. One last thing, and it's counter to what most people believe, but you should program your training in distance rather than time. Setting your training to time will create an incentive where you're more likely to push the pace on your runs, because that will give you a little bit of extra distance for the same amount of time. But if you program your training to distance, it doesn't matter if you do an 8 kilometer run at 4 minutes a kilometer or 7 minutes a kilometer. At the end, you'll have done 8 kilometers. So there's no need to push the pace. You just have to stick to the plan, and at the end, you'll have the mileage that you've set for yourself regardless of the pace. So let's get stuck in. Okay, so here we are. we've got our 60-kilometre a week athlete, and this is a fairly typical schedule, I'd say, particularly for people in Hobart, where I live. This tends to be very common kind of training plan. I'd say it's a little bit lopsided, but this is what people end up doing. We've got our VO2 max workout on the Tuesday, a bit of a shorter run here on the Wednesday, slightly longer on the Thursday, day off on the Friday, doing a race on the Saturday. That might be a cross-country race, might even be a track race, but very often it's a park run. I think maybe for people overseas, in the UK, definitely a park run. We've got our long run on Sunday. In Hobart, I'd say it's typically probably longer than that. So we do get this very lopsided kind of training approach where we've got probably our 3 hardest days wedged into the 4 days of the week. Not ideal, but I guess people just conform to a kind of group where that's just how things end up panning out. So we're going to take our 60-kilometre a week runner who's probably stuck here because for the most part they're doing these harder sessions and they're having these recovery troughs afterwards. Maybe not so on the Sunday, maybe they're still a little bit amped up from their park run. They can get through Sunday, but they're feeling pretty cooked on Monday. They get to their VO2 max workout, get through it, and then they're really, really struggling on a Wednesday, but they're probably still going to run their easy runs too fast. So in this kind of setup, you're probably not really recovered from this workout until Saturday, and then you're not really recovered from this weekend until Wednesday. And so you're basically putting yourself in this constant fatigue deficit. Even though you're doing very, very low mileage, you're still, I would say, overtraining. It's not very well spaced out. These two efforts are too hard for how much you can handle. And you might be getting through it just fine in terms of not getting injured, but you're not moving forward because your body's just not receptive to a training effect because it just doesn't have that aerobic base to really get anything from these workouts which have a higher anaerobic component. Okay, so let's get stuck in. So we've got our 60 kilometers a week, and then what we're going to do is start with this. Now, the first thing you'll notice is there's no intensity in there. Lots of people will say, well, I could drop down to doing 2 threshold sessions a week, and yeah, that would definitely be a step in the right direction. However, my rule is the lower the intensity of your runs, the faster you're going to be able to ramp things up in terms of volume. So if someone came to me and then they said, I want to spend 3 months increasing that volume as quickly as possible without getting injured, this is essentially what I would give them. It involves the most amount of risk that I'd be willing to assume for someone. Other people might want to take more risk. That's up to them. But for me, this is how I would do it. And really, this person, they've been spending so much time doing these higher intensity workouts and they're getting nowhere. They just need a reset. They need to focus on zone 1 and zone 2, getting those aerobic adaptations just so that they can handle more training overall. But they want to do it in a way that they're not going to get injured. So spending 3 months of just easy running, I don't think it's going to hurt you. I think in the long term, it's going to set you up to just have a much, much bigger base. When you reintroduce those workouts, you're going to then have a lot more room for improvement. Now, I would say once you've got through this period, a better approach would be to reintroduce threshold workouts rather than those higher intensity ones. But that's up to you. And that's a video for a different day. So here we go. Our first week. You'll see straight away, I've introduced 2 days of doubles. Now, these should not be too taxing. I think people assume that running twice in a day is really difficult. Maybe at first it's going to be a bit of a weird sensation, but it is much easier on your body, assuming you do them easy. We're going to go 62 kilometers straight away. Our long run isn't particularly long, but you probably do want to keep things fairly even. I mean, you do have slightly more on your double days, slightly more on your long run, but you probably don't want a day to be twice as big as any other day. You want to keep things fairly even across the board, I would say, just to, again, to spread that load. So what we're going to do, and here's the big secret, and it's going to appear overly simplistic, but simplicity is good. Simplicity is easy to follow. What we're going to do is just copy this, paste it to the next week, and then all we're going to do is add 2 kilometers across the board, but we're going to spread it out and we're going to do it in little 500 meter increments. So what I would do is maybe add 0.5 here, maybe add another 0.5 here. Maybe we add 0.5 to our Monday run, and then maybe we want to go a little bit further on our Sunday because an hour, it's not really doing it for us, but there we have it. We've got 64 kilometers for that week, and that should be really, really easy. We just follow this process again for every other run during this period. I've separated them into 4-week blocks because we're going to do something slightly different in each of these blocks, but again, we can just bump it up 500 meters at a time. Really easy. You might not want to do it to the same runs. Maybe a 6K run, it's too short of a run. You need something a little bit more. We've got that. We can then extend our long run back out to 13K. And there we go, 66 kilometers for the week. Then we do it again. Now, here comes the slight change. What we're going to do after 4 weeks is we're going to add in another double. Add in our extra double. So we've added, we're at 13.5 kilometers where we had a 9.5 kilometer run before. So we're going to have to drop it down by 2 kilometers to get ourselves up to just adding that extra 2 kilometers for the week. So what I would suggest is, again, we just strip it out, spread the load again, strip things out, drop things back down, and then we are at 70 kilometers for the week. And then again, we're just repeating the same process, copying, pasting, very simple, adding those back in. All right, and then once we've finished that block of 4, we're then gonna change it up slightly again. We're gonna copy, we're gonna go paste, but we're going to go to 7 days a week rather than 6. So what we're gonna do is just add in a much easier day to start with. So we're just going to do a 5K run, and people will say, oh, that's too short of a run. But again, it's with the aim of building it up gradually. So maybe we start a little bit below what we think is going to be worth it. But yeah, we're just opening up that new channel. We're trying to do it in a low stress way. So what we're going to have to do is drop out 3 kilometers again because we've added in 5. The way to do that, again, just to spread it across, let's go back. We'll do 9 here. Maybe we just do 9 here, and then we just do 6 there, and we're up to 78 kilometers. Repeating the same process, 78 kilometers, and continuing on down. Okay, until eventually we get ourselves to 84 kilometers. It's almost too easy, really, but that's how you should do it. Just inching things up, spreading it out. You're never biting off too big of a chunk. You're just almost tricking your body into doing more work. We want to avoid these big spikes where your body's going to notice it and it's going to maybe reject it. We want to just creep up on it. That's what's going to eventually get us there. It's going to require patience. It might be quite boring, but in my experience, boring is effective. And look, you might say, with all of this easy running, it's going to get quite stale. I'm going to lose my turnover. If you feel that way, I would suggest maybe you could add in strides twice a week. Maybe you do 4 to 6 by 80 meters with a walk back in between. That should get those fast twitch muscle fibers activated. But I think once you actually reintroduce workouts, maybe you'd be a little bit rusty for the first couple of sessions, but it comes back very, very quickly. If you like these kind of nerdy training videos, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, you can never take your hobby jogging too seriously.